So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Debbie Schwartz, the founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group. And I'm here tonight with Rebecca Chabro and Ellen Whalen. And Rebecca and Ellen both work with me in a service that we have, which we just renamed, called College Insights Academy. And we've been doing these presentations. Whoops, we just lost Rebecca for a second. We've been doing these presentations for a long time. Some of them are public, and we also do a lot of them for people who are in the College Insights Academy. So Rebecca, I hope that you're coming back. And oh, people are still in the waiting room. Let's see. Okay. So let's see the poll results. Okay. Not surprising, most people here tonight, class of 2023, you were in the right place. And nice to see that a lot of people have started to do college visits, started to research online. Okay, about a little over 50% of you have started to do a college list. I see more of you need to do a college budget. More of you need to estimate your EFC. Not surprising that you haven't started focusing on essays yet. Hopefully that is pretty soon. And okay, a very low number of you haven't started yet at all. So that's we're in a good spot. Let's see, Rebecca's saying you might want to highlight me again. I accidentally logged off. Okay, yes, let's find you, Rebecca. There you are.
That I was being recorded, and that signed me off.
Okay. So Rebecca's back. We're going to get started. A few little housekeeping rules. One is these were meetings because two reasons. One is personally, I like seeing people's faces if you're willing to be on video. And the second is if you really, really have a question, I think it's great if you want to unmute yourself and ask that question. But otherwise, feel free to put your question in the chat. We're going to try to get to the questions, but what we're going to do today is go through as much of the presentation as possible and then save a lot of the questions to the end, just because if people don't want to stay on, they will have gotten a lot of the material and they don't necessarily have to wait for the questions. And we're also going to be timely. That's not always my best trait. We sometimes just keep going and going because we want to answer people's questions, but we're going to try and do this in about 50 minutes and then answer questions afterwards. So we don't take up a lot of your night. And with that, Ellen, I'm going to unspotlight you, but we'll get to you. We'll bring you back. And I'm going to start sharing. Great. And can you guys see thumbs up? People can see the, great. Okay. So tonight we're talking about, insights of that, of what we've seen in the admissions cycles. And it's really going to actually look at admissions from this past season that just ended and last year, and what some of the implications might be for families of juniors or rising seniors as you're kind of starting to really get into the meat of the process and putting together your students' lists and looking at schools and really figuring out, how to potentially write your students' essays. Just if people, so tonight, this session is a very, very similar session to what we do in a program that we have called College Insights Academy Live. And we do these types of sessions probably 4 or 5 times a month on all different topics. We really get into the meat and the data and the insights of what's going on in college admissions and what it means for your students. We have several people, many families in the program now. but we're running one more special. If anybody wants to join, it's going to be available between now and Sunday. If you'd like to still join, we, it's not that we're going to actually not let people join later, but this is going to be like the last time that we're offering an actual pricing special, because we really want to encourage you to get started if you haven't already. So if you're interested, just please check out roadtocollege.com/join now. You can see the details of what we do in the academy. And I'll just quickly tell you, it is just a session like we have tonight. We have these, again, multiple times a month. You get access to College Insights, which is our search tool to help you build a college list. You get access to a private Facebook group where we have continue to have these discussions. We continue to answer questions, and you actually get discounts on any one-on-one services if you feel that you need that. But to tell you the truth, our goal is to teach you and share with you our understanding of the industry or the space, so that you have as much knowledge as you need to do a lot of this work on your own. And if you feel like you're running into roadblocks, that's when people might ask for additional services. But a lot of people just use the membership and can manage it with the information that they acquire, or if they have to ask questions along the way. So, and the last thing is, if you do join by tomorrow night, we are going to offer you the Ron Lieber's The Price You Pay for College, an excellent book. If you haven't gotten it, it's really worth reading. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca in 1 second, just to tell you tonight, Rebecca's going to give you a high level view about what's been going on in admissions over the past 2 years. She's going to talk a little bit more detail about what happened in early decision and early action for this particular admission cycle. Go into detail about what just ended in the 2026 admissions data. And then Ellen's going to give you a deep dive, like a case study of how you might go about researching and using some of the techniques that we walk through for a particular school. And then we're going to give you some words of wisdom. Let me just say one last thing before I hand it to Rebecca. It might look like the data that we're always sharing is data related to, more selective schools, that we're focused on highly selective schools. That is truly not the case. The only reason that it appears that way is because the reality is that those schools tend to share the most data. That's one. And secondly, they do tend to kind of set the pathway. So what happens at some of the elite schools tends to trickle down into some of the less selective schools. So we do not necessarily focus on those schools, but we do use the data from those schools because we can get our hands on it and because we can use it to interpret what's going to happen for the rest of the schools. So just wanted to put that out there. Rebecca, I'm going to hand it off to you. And if I don't move fast enough, just tell me.
Okay, great. So we are going to first talk about application trends from basically beginning of COVID, really right before COVID to now, and see how things have been affected by COVID, which has been a lot. So COVID has caused a lot of uncertainty in all of our lives, including in college admissions. As a result, with uncertainty, people get nervous and they try to overcompensate for things. So one thing that's happened in COVID is there has been an increase in applications, and this in large part might be due to the fact that a lot of schools went test optional. So that barrier of the standardized test scores that could have stood in the way is no longer that barrier that people might think would keep them out of college. And so there's actually been a 14.4% increase in distinct applicants. So these are people, not applications. So you could see how that rose over the last 2 years. And so there, as with most of the trends in college admissions over the last 2 years, the year-over-year increase for the first year was steeper than this most recent year. Another trend that you'll see when we look at the applications, but is that there was a trend that larger schools and public universities got more popular, probably because cost was on a lot of people's minds. And in the New England and the Mid-Atlantic, there's a lot of smaller colleges. And so growth in applicants happened really across all regions, except for that New England and Mid-Atlantic region. International applicants increased at around 3 times the rate of domestic applicants. So even though, travel was limited at first, the applications really rose. And so there was a 12 to 33% increase in international applicants. So that's really huge. And it's made it more selective for international applicants. I know that I work with a lot of international students, and it's definitely been a little bit of a struggle working with them, just because there's so many fewer spots. I think I heard one statistic that, over 50% of the new applicants are international applicants. So of the applicants that are, I guess, new to, in addition to what we had before. International applicants heavily target those prominent colleges. So those most highly selective colleges, they are primarily applying to those. I know with my students, it's really hard to get them to apply to the non-name brand top, research universities. Those are the ones they know of, the name recognition, and so they apply to them, which thus makes them even more competitive. So as would be expected, China, India, and actually Canada are the top countries that are sending students to the United States. So that was applicants. So in terms of applications, there's actually more applications per student than before. We've seen, if you look at that second bullet point there, a 6% increase in average applications per applicant. So, 5.3 apps on average up to 5.6 apps might not seem like a big difference, but when you multiply that by all the people that are applying, it ends up being a really significant difference, as you can see.
And Rebecca, what I saw too, and we should probably break this out, is that, that's an average across all schools. But if we actually looked at applications at certain types of schools, schools that are in the upper quadrant, of what if you want to kind of look at them of some sort of ranking, they got the students who are applying to those schools are applying to many more applications going out than just the 5.6.
Yeah. So 5.3, that's heavily saturated by, there's so many students who apply to 1 or 2 local public universities, and that's all they apply to. They get in, great. I had a few students like that myself this year, but then I've had students that apply to close to 30 colleges, which is absolutely absurd. So it's, that's very much the average. And I would say for people who are looking to apply to colleges more on the national landscape, not so much wanting to stay local, which is typically the population that I've seen us working with. Not that we don't encourage everyone to join, but that is, people are generally applying to more colleges. I used to recommend 6 to 8 colleges. Then I was recommending 8 to 10. Now I recommend 10 to 12 colleges. So even that number has gone up, but the amount that I see my students applying to sometimes is just way too many. But that has resulted, because there's so much uncertainty, a 21.3% increase in applications over the past 2 years. As you can see, that first year, once again, was a steeper increase, but still, almost as much of an increase this year. So numbers, the acceptance rates are continuing to go down, which in turn, it's, a cycle, it's a vicious cycle. And so hopefully, it has slowed down, and that's, I think the hope is that it will continue to slow down. So maybe next year we'll see 7% increase, hopefully not that much, but we are looking at increases, but slowing down over the next few years, probably.
I have a quick question.
Yep, go ahead.
Is that over all schools or selective schools? Or
so that number was over all schools. All schools on the Common
App.
So this data that we're pulling here is from the Common Application as of March 15th, which is after the January 1st deadline. So it doesn't include the University of California schools. It doesn't include a few other schools, but most colleges on the national landscape are on the common application. So what it might not include are a lot of like the more local public universities. I know I live in Pennsylvania and we have schools, the PASHE schools, which are the Pennsylvania higher education, or it's a group of universities that are not Penn State and not Temple Pitt or Temple Pitt or Penn State. And those schools, most of them are not on the common application and attract more of a regional crowd, so regional population. So those kinds of schools aren't included in here, but yeah, so this is.
Sandra, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Yes, my question is, you said, for example, that the international students, it's 3 times greater, the percentage is 3 times greater, but are the universities still, for example, are they still, if what they normally accepted in international students was say 30% of their freshman class, are they still holding it at 30%?
No, yes,
Or
for the most part, yes. I mean,
Okay.
it might rise a 1% or 2. It might fluctuate a little, but as I've been seeing, it's become even more selective for those international students because ultimately they're not going to be accepting 3 times as many international students as they were before. So yeah. But it's just that more applicants applying.
But to really answer your question, I have to say we probably will have to wait to see. We don't have all the details of this season, so that would be a really interesting, data point to look at. Probably, hopefully we'll find that out over the summer. Is we saw the increase in the applications, but when they give us the real breakdown of the admissions data, it would be interesting to kind of like, look at those 2 pieces and compare.
And you'll see it later, but really what colleges are trying to increase right now are their underrepresented populations, which are, so low income, first generation college students, underrepresented minorities, which are Black, Latinx, or Native American. So those are the students that they're trying to increase percentage of their total enrollment. So I would say that, and we'll talk in a bit about how, the test optional has really helped that population and encourage them to apply more to college.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as I said, 21.3% increase in applications over all Common App institutions, but that's not representative of those most selective colleges. Really, those most selective colleges are getting much higher increases in applications. Colgate University, which was kind of bizarre, I don't even know if they could explain it, they more than doubled their applications. They, have almost 150% more applications than they did before COVID. MIT actually, so they have one of the highest increases in applications, and they are one of the few schools who have said, you know what, we are taking away test optional. We are going back to requiring standardized test scores. And it's in large part because, they found through their studies that test scores really were indicative of success. But you can also see, it's not like they need more applicants. They already have more than enough applicants, and then they got 69% more in the past 2 years. But as you can see, it's these, for the most part, the really highly selective colleges that are getting that huge increase, which they were already hard to get into. They were already highly selective. It's just becoming that much harder to get into. I was talking about those underrepresented populations before. And so test optional, which basically for those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you have heard of the SATs or the ACTs, standardized tests to kind of get into college. A lot of small liberal arts colleges for years have gone test optional where they do not require those tests. When COVID hit, there was less accessibility to those tests. And so a lot of the colleges almost all of the colleges went test optional. And so because of that, standardized testing is notorious for not being equitable with lower income and first generation underrepresented minority applicants. And so that was a barrier for students in applying to college before. And now without that, a lot of students figure, okay, now I can apply. And so you have been seeing that, increase. So there's an 18% increase in underrepresented minority applicants, 22% in first generation applicants, 15% in fee waiver, which is the low income applicants. And so, that has been something good that we have seen from, COVID and the increase in applicants, but at least there's work towards equity. And I'll tell you, at any college admissions conference, over half the sessions, probably over 3/4 of the sessions, are all about equity. It's something that the industry is really focused on, because obviously education is a way to close, the gap. So test optional, as we talked about. So last year, so this past cycle, only 5% of Common App member colleges required standardized test scores, which was down from 11% last year. So fairtest.org is the kind of the nonprofit that advocates for, test-free, standardized, no standardized testing used in admissions. And they said that 80% of colleges are test optional, meaning they don't require standardized test scores, or test blind, meaning that even if you send them, they will not look at them. So Common App isn't one of them, but, or University of California isn't on the Common App, but University of California system is actually test blind, as is the Cal State system. So there's some other colleges, Dickinson, Reed, some smaller colleges that are also test blind as well. But that being said, after there was a significant drop in, so 33% in score reporting, so last year, which is obviously because there were no seats available at test centers during COVID, and it wasn't safe to be in a test center for 3 hours on a Saturday morning, nearby somebody with COVID going on. But score reporting has slightly increased this past year, and that's due to more test availability, but also evidence that test scores, that strong test scores can help. I think one of the big reasons that there was such an increase in applications, besides just the uncertainty of COVID, but being test optional, a lot of students felt like that they were now admissible at schools they might not have been admissible at before. But and some certainly were. There are certainly some very impressive, strong students who were, maybe just not good test takers, but there is a really strong correlation between good test takers and top students. And so for the most part, students who were able to produce those top test scores often also have top grades. And so if you look at the percentage of students who get in with using standardized test scores compared to the percentage of students who go test optional at most highly selective universities that report it, still it was a higher percentage of students who submitted test scores than that. So that kind of helped towards the increase in submissions this year. So early decision, early action results. So for those of you who don't know what that is, early decision is a binding application, typically November 1st deadline, sometimes November 15th. And you can only apply to one school early decision. If you get accepted to that school, you are committing to attend. That's why you can only apply to one early decision. It's binding. So that should be your top choice school. Early action is an early application, also typically in November, although there are some in October, even September, but for the most part, November 1st or November 15th. And early action, you apply early, you find out early, but it's non-binding. So you do not have to attend. Generally, you can apply to as many early action schools as possible. There are really 4. There's Princeton, Yale, Harvard, and Stanford, and actually Notre Dame all have single choice early action, which means you can only apply to them early action, and public universities, and you can't apply anywhere early decision. So just explaining what early decision and early action are. So early decision numbers, with all this uncertainty, early decision is good for, both sides, for students who want a little bit of an advantage. It definitely helped kind of, give that advantage to some of the students. And then for these colleges with so much uncertainty, you got to figure if somebody's applying to Harvard and then or not Harvard, or Penn, and they're applying to all the other Ivy League schools, and let's say they get into a few of them, they're only going to be able to go to one. And so early decision can lock a really top student in. And so early decision applications increased at highly selective colleges, but really varied by how much. Other than Duke, for some reason, it did not increase at Duke. I can't really explain that. But all colleges saw that increase in early decision applications for the last year. And then so between 2019, 2020, which was COVID happened right in the middle of that cycle. And then the first year of full COVID cycle, which was the class of 2025. So all colleges saw an increase in early decision applications that year. But Duke, Penn, Dartmouth, and Columbia saw slight decreases in early decision applications for this past cycle. So a little less uncertainty, and I think that's part of why there's a little bit of that drop. Early application numbers increased at highly selective colleges, but also varied as to how much. Most colleges saw that increase saw the increase in applications for last year's seniors. And then this year, Yale, Harvard, MIT actually saw a decrease. And for Yale, one thing to note with early action is it is not binding. So there's not really typically as big of an advantage. And with Yale and Harvard, so they are single choice. And so people, especially with financial aid, might want some options and to weigh their options financially. I know I have a student, a lot of these schools, they may meet full need, but, I had a student who got into Penn, Chicago, and Rice, and Penn, all of them, say they meet full need, but her, one of the schools gave her financial aid beyond her need. And so she's attending Rice, where you might not expect that Rice be where she attends when she got into Chicago and Penn. Rice is an excellent school, but they gave her merit-based aid in addition to need-based aid. And so that might be a reason not to put all your eggs in one basket in terms of a single choice option. All right, so early decision results. So really, increased as one would expect with more applications. There's still, except for Rice, which actually did increase, has decided that they're going to increase their enrollment by 20% over a 4-year span now that we're in the middle of. Most colleges are staying relatively the same size. And so if you're increasing applications, then generally you're going to have lower admit rates because there's only so many spaces. But there weren't, one thing that was interesting to see is that there weren't necessarily always fewer students. You can still admit more students during early decision to kind of lock those students in, which, because there's uncertainty for the colleges as well. But, still, because so many more students applied, you could still have those lower acceptance rates. All right, next. Okay, so these are early action results. So same thing kind of that we saw. And so with the, lower admits because more students were typically admitted. They don't typically raise as much for early action as they do for early decision, just because it's not binding and there's not as much of an advantage. But Harvard, because their early apps went down, Harvard and Yale, their early apps went down a little bit, their admit rate or the number of admits that they accepted largely stayed the same. Okay, so some colleges will have 2 rounds of early decision 1 and early decision 2. And there's really, unfortunately, you saw all the data that I had for early decision schools. Many of them have both early decision 1 and early decision 2, but these were the only 3 schools that I found that actually reported their data for each round. And as you can see, if you look at the last 2 columns, you can look at the early decision 1 admit rate and the early decision 2 admit rate at Hopkins, 3 times the admit rate, 3 times more higher percentage of students were admitted during early decision 2 than early decision 1. Early decision 2 is generally going to be January 1st. So same as the regular decision deadline, but you're committing to attend if admitted. Boston College, it was just slightly higher, but then you could see at Emory, it was higher during early decision 1. So if you're interested in one of those schools, you might want to look specifically at what their early decision 1 and early decision 2 rate is and make your decision accordingly. So, is there that early decision advantage? So there often is a slight advantage to applying early decision because, like I said, these colleges, every student's only going to go to one college, right? So you can't be in two places at once. So it would be really hard to, at least. And also they check and you're not allowed. But so they're competing over the top applicants. And so this guarantees that you will fill one of their seats. You're also reviewed in a smaller pool. Not everyone can apply early decision. Not everyone knows they want to go somewhere as their first choice. Maybe you need to compare financial aid packages. And so you're reviewed in that smaller applicant pool. So that could help as well. But something to be aware of, and we'll show you on another slide, early decision advantages are inflated a lot of the time, especially at the smaller colleges because of recruited athletes and other prioritized applicants. But you can see here the early decision acceptance rates compared to regular decision acceptance rates at a variety of schools. We have, a large public university, University of Virginia, medium-sized colleges of Boston College and Johns Hopkins and Williams. And as you can see, at each of these schools, there is an advantage to applying early decision. So just something to consider. So like I said, athletes, this was some data I just pulled the other day. I would love to do a whole dissertation on how athletics impacts college admissions. But most recruited athletes do come in during the early decision, early action rounds if they're offered. When they're made an offer by the coaches, they're saying, all right, you have to apply early decision because we need to lock it up. And so they're coming in then and they're being supported by coaches, and athletics bring a lot of money to a school, and you need to fill all the spots on a team and all your positions and all of the teams. And so athletics is a priority for a lot of admissions. The smaller the school, the less of an early decision or early action advantage without a tip. I don't know if I was listening to a podcast or something, but somewhere, I think it was Amherst, and Amherst has more varsity athletes than the University of Alabama. And so, you think this huge school with thousands, tens of 20,000s of students, even more, Alabama, and then little Amherst with, 2,000 students. Amherst has more athletes. And so, more athletes. And so those athletes are taking up a bigger percentage. Typically at those small top elite liberal arts colleges, about a third of the class is a varsity athlete. And so
you don't think about it. All those schools are competing in the same, sports, and in general, they have a smaller student population, but if they need the same number of athletes, just as you said, athletes take up a higher percentage of this overall student population. Yeah.
And so if a third of the freshman class is coming in, and if you look at the early decision, the percentage of the classes at these schools filled by early decision students, it's usually around 50%. And if you figure a third of the class is coming in as a supported recruited athlete, then that leaves not as many spots as you would think. And so you can see the numbers here. Davidson College, which is the smallest of the ones that we have, they said in a 2019 article in the Washington Post, typically offers of admission, they typically offer admission to 125 to 135 recruited athletes a year. I went in the middle, took 130. So that means, the early decision, early action acceptance rate there was 44%. But if we use those numbers, the projected early decision, early action rate early decision rate without athletic tip is 32%. Now that's still higher than the 17% regular decision rate, but it's not quite as sweet as it seems. As you can see, as the school gets bigger, there's less of a change. Now, Berkeley doesn't have early decision. You see Berkeley just has one deadline, but you can see because there's so many students, they take 250 student athletes a year, but that's really minimal change. 0.2% acceptance rate. So you can see how the smaller the school, the more it matters. And that's why, when people ask me, should I submit my standardized test scores or not? I always say it depends, because at smaller colleges, you need to be that much more impressive. Also, because you got to figure those recruited athletes are going to have overall, because they're, priority because of their athletic skills, may not have as high test scores, and so they need to balance those out. All right, so now we're looking at the most recent, so overall total early decision, regular decision, this past application round. So there's, really just, as you can see on the graph, obviously it's a lot, but you can see in almost all cases that, teal color on the right is the highest one out of the three in the grouping. So it's showing that consistently, for the most part, college, the number of applications are continuing to rise. So 26% to highly selective schools. So the highly selective schools where the admit rate is under 50%, it's an average of 26% increase, and then an 18% increase for those under 50% acceptance rate. So generally, it does vary, but you can see that those highly selective schools are continuing to grow in applications, which we talked about earlier. So in terms of acceptance rates, so the most selective colleges, so here we're looking at the colleges these are the national universities. So US News rankings, which is the most widely talked about rankings, they have two main categories: national universities, which are the research universities, more research focused, and then they have liberal arts colleges, which tend to be more undergraduate teaching focused. And so they break the colleges up into that. Both have excellent, prestigious, very highly selective schools. So these are the most selective of the national universities that reported data. And so, they varied on how they handled their increase of applications. All of them have lower admit rates than they did at the beginning of COVID. But the decline in admit rates has slowed down. So it was more, as the increase in applications was more drastic last year, so was the decrease in admit rate. This year it's kind of evened out a little, but it's still not, it's still, the admit rate is still going down at almost all of these schools, and definitely over a 2-year period. And yeah, it's continuing to get more and more competitive at these schools. So what happens?
Sorry, Rebecca.
So going back, we go back to that because I have some interesting things to note here. Actually, hold on. So this is the admit rates, because I took some notes here on my side. So with Northeastern, you can see there's, they admitted 630 more students last year than they did the year before in 2020. And they had a much higher yield. So yield is the percentage of students that decide to attend a school, the percentage of accepted students that decide to attend. So prior to COVID, Northeastern had 23.7% of students that they admitted choose to attend. Last year, they had 32.6%. So not only did they admit 630 more students, but then they had 9% more higher yield. So they had a lot of students, too many students over enrolled this past year. So that resulted in a major drop this year of 7,442 fewer admits this year. So that's where that number comes from.
So sometimes it is really important to kind of look at what happened the year before, because that could have positive and negative impacts on the, in the year that we're going to go into. So just as like Rebecca just showed, Northeastern accepted more, had a higher yield. Quite honestly, they have a physical limitation, and they they bumped up beyond that physical limitation of being able to house those students. So they had to, now this coming year, they had to cut back a little bit on who they accepted.
Yeah, Cornell had a similar problem, but with less drastic. So it was, they didn't admit quite as many more last year, and then they saw similar yield patterns resulting in a drop that wasn't quite as drastic as Northwestern. Right,
Sandra, do you have a question?
Yes, my question is, I understand that there's more applicants because of test optional and all that. I understand also that there was a 3 times increase of international students, But is all these, could another reason for all these applications be also because people postponed going to college because of the pandemic, or no? I mean, I'm just wondering, what are the reasons for the massive increase in applicants?
Uncertainty. So the ones that postponed, you got to figure COVID hit after, COVID hit in March. Applications were due in January. So students applied and then a lot of them deferred, meaning that they took a gap year, much higher percentage than had previously. And that did impact admission acceptance rates last year. But in terms of the numbers applying, that's really not the big increase. It's more so the uncertainty, the uncertainty, because with so many more people applying, I'd say initially it was test optional, but then once people hear people are applying to more schools, then they feel like it's going to be uncertain, and then they apply to more schools to make up for it.
I think it's less the increase in applicants, and it's more the increase in applications.
Yeah. Although you did see applicants did rise, but not at the level that applications rose.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, yeah. And so, Rice also admitted significantly more last year, but like I said, they're making efforts to increase their enrollment size. So that's why they didn't quite go down this year, or as much this year. So that's just something to note.
Okay.
I took a few more notes. Yeah, we'll move on.
Okay.
So this is just more, these are the next kind of most selective. So 10, of the data that I had. So overall, once again, they're dropping at a slower rate. Some colleges, their admit rates actually went up, but minimally. So, and then if you look really at the details, like University of Virginia, the first year of COVID, last year likely admitted more out-of-state students due to the unpredictable yield during COVID. Boston College likely admitted more because in 2020, because they're lower ranked than a lot of their peer institutions kind of in that area, possibly. I don't know. So, and then University of Georgia is really representative of that increase in students applying to public schools. But you can see they still did drop their admit rate, even with that many more applicants. So we were talking, is test optional truly test optional? And so you can see here, very few colleges, this is really the only colleges we have the data from, but very few colleges are transparent about their test optional admissions practices. So, and like I said, it's usually there's a correlation between strong test takers and not. And you can see that, the percentage of students who applied with standardized tests, the number who applied with standardized tests or without standardized tests is, so at Fordham, 65% applied without standardized tests, 57% were accepted without standardized tests. So it's not quite even. And so you can really see that across the board that although that standardized tests really do help, although Fordham was probably the closest to true test optional.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah.
You just said something like very few colleges, they're transparent about that. Does that go for like all the colleges, or is that the selective, like the highly selective schools, or
a lot of them.
The selective colleges are more transparent about their admissions data, or they at least broadcast their admissions data, where others don't really do it until something comes out called the common data set, which is where we get a lot of our information from. But like the common data set for last year's admission cycle just came out recently, has just been starting to be posted on the college admissions website.
So usually if there's information that we can get, it's a year later. I mean, it's not that that's bad, because honestly, that's the information that everybody gets. So it's but like the information we're showing right now is information that colleges shared like from this recent admission season.
Yeah.
And this was only 3 schools that were willing to share.
Yeah, it's press releases, but really it's only the most selective colleges that make those press releases. In part
now,
because
when you say the like selective colleges, you were saying that's anything with an acceptance rate under 50%?
So I'd say, that's I guess term selective could be anything under 50, but really it's mostly the highly selective colleges that are going to broadcast those results. It's very rare, even that, I mean, if you look at the data we have, you'll see, on the, I believe it's one of the previous slides, but I only had, I'm looking right now because I have it open on another screen. But of all the colleges that I listed for national universities, only 2 of them, and really only 1, had an admit rate of over 20%. And it was Virginia in-state, which was 27%, and Georgia, which was 41.9. So it's not that I chose not to, it's just that a lot of the schools that have more than 20% admit rates don't broadcast it as much as the ones that have lower.
And let me emphasize, and we actually really encourage this a lot. I mean, I wish we had access to all the data that we wanted to answer these questions, but and I can't tell you whether you'll be successful, but there is no harm in asking these questions, even if the school hasn't publicly shared the information. So if there's a school that your child is interested in that is test optional, they may not have shared, the numbers that we're showing here for Fordham and Notre Dame and Wellesley, but ask. They may say no, but at least.
So ask them for this information, like on this graph.
Yeah, ask them and say, I'm curious. You're test optional. Do you have more information that you can share about, the students who you accepted with test scores and without? They may say no, but at least you've tried.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. But one thing, we are very data driven here at Road to College, and that we will, if there's data available, we will give it to you. But we only can give you what we can get. So,
right. And sorry, just to emphasize, but the more parents that ask, then the more pressure there is on schools, hopefully, that they'll feel to share ultimately.
Yeah.
So,
and once again, like very few schools will report demographic breakdown. They do on the common data set, this document that the colleges put out in spring of every year about their previous year cycle and the previous academic year. Those are, those will have demographic breakdowns of their actual enrolled students. Very few colleges actually are transparent, and you can see that they report it in different ways in terms of, racial demographics. While there is, a push towards equity, there still isn't, it's not quite there yet in terms of getting, having it representative of the total population. But a lot of these colleges are working towards that. Next. So then the other thing that's really interesting is some colleges will report whether they have public, what percentage of students go to public or charter schools and what percent go to private schools. And they'll, they might brag, Swarthmore might say 66% of our students, are from public schools. But if 90% of the United States population is from public schools, then it's still a major advantage going to a private school. And that's in part because private schools have have college counselors on staff. I personally, my entire job, my full-time job is working with, I have maximum of like 30 seniors, 30 students in each class. And that, I'm working with those 30 students, whereas when I worked at a public school, and my job is only college counseling, where when I worked at a public school, I had a caseload of, 500 students or 250 students, much bigger. And I was responsible not only for college admissions, but also for social emotional well-being and academic advising and improvement. So private school students have a huge advantage within college admissions, but that's part of why we have, this program with Road to College is, I basically, I make these presentations for Road to College, and then I also present them to my students. So it's the information that students at private schools are getting, you're getting here through Road to College.
So, Rebecca, I'm going to jump if you to let Ellen do her case study, and then we'll come back. That's okay. We'll bring back your implications, because then we'll also flow into kind of other words of wisdom. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, Ellen, I'm going to spotlight you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Debbie. So I'm Ellen Whalen, and I'm a counselor in residence with Road to College, and in their new CIA, which is College Insight Academy. And so what I wanted to do was kind of take a lot of the information that Rebecca shared with us and taught us and do a case study with it and try to be really specific and see how you might help kind of define your students' path through this process. And I just want to say that I just finished going through this a second time personally. My youngest is a senior this year. So it's definitely can be a wild ride. And I just want to say that I can empathize. So, all right, let's see. One of the most important things to do is research. And I love doing research and Rebecca loves doing research. And it's really an integral part of the process. And so College Insights is really, really helpful. One of the reasons I got involved with Debbie was because I loved how College Insights had so much data, gave it to me at my fingertips. So, because I used to have to go to all different sites. So it really does encapsulate everything really well. Now, the data that I'm going to be showing, I found through College Insights, and I found through just Googling like this right now, the data that Rebecca was talking about, where she was getting her hands on, it's as simple as putting in the college, let's just say Harvard, class of 2026, and often you'll get their press release. And that's where you get the latest data, the current data for right now. Otherwise, it tends to be a year drag when it's in US News and World Report and things like that. Okay, signing up for the newspapers. Now it's hard to do it for every school, but your students may be top 5 schools, maybe 10 if you can handle it. Amazing information to just understand what's going on in the school. And also that's where the press release is where they put
Usually
their data.
a school's newspaper takes the press release and then they dig deeper. You know, they obviously, you know, talk to the admissions office and everything. And they usually the school newspaper does like a highlight, you know, and a deep dive on the school's numbers.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Sometimes I feel like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I have access to this stuff. And it's as simple as that. So then colleges, Twitter and Facebook also can have a lot of good information too. So, all right, next slide. All right, so students can have hooks. They can have like a bucket that they might fall into. And so hooks would be like a legacy, an athlete. A bucket could be just that you happen to be applying from a geographical area, maybe from Texas when you're applying to the Northeast. But if you don't have kind of those things, or more in general, we're talking about figuring out what your lane is as you go, your student goes on this college admissions journey. And everyone kind of has a lane where they can excel. And it depends how broad you want to make your lane. But basically, these are some of the factors that help contribute to your lane. And obviously, the college list is the biggest piece in all of this. And so these are kind of components of that. But are you going to apply early and regular or rolling? A lot of school students should apply rolling if they can, just to get a school under their belt. And Pitt and Arizona State University. Those are 2 really good ones if, you know, bigger schools are okay with your student. So just a thought there. And then they can know maybe by October, November, December that they're in. So research university versus liberal arts, like Rebecca said, that, you know, liberal arts are really small. They're great. I love liberal arts. I went to Wellesley, a big believer in liberal arts, but research universities have more room. That being said, research university, student might have to choose like the School of Business. Liberal arts, they don't have to choose what they're going to major in. And so depending upon the school in a research university, there can be different admissions rates. And that isn't always public information. That can be hard to find. So ask, dig, but don't always expect to find the specific admissions rates. Public versus private. Public schools can be less expensive than privates. That being said, the privates can have much more financial aid, where a student could go to a $82,000 school for free if they have a lot of need, where a public university doesn't have the funding. So that would be much more rare to happen. Possible, but less likely. So in-state versus out-of-state, there could be advantages. Some places have caps on students applying out of state, like Texas and I think UVA. But then you have places like UMass Amherst was taking students with lower scores because they wanted the out-of-states to pay full price. So they had an advantage. So every state situation is different. And like the California's state system, they had to cut back on how many students they were taking out of state because there's such huge demand in state. So you got to just research that stuff. But obviously, in-state university is a good win for a student generally. Then there's flagship versus regional when we're talking about state schools, and the flagship usually is harder to get into and more well-known. But the regional has a lower acceptance rate and could be right for your student. Honors colleges at state schools are even more difficult to get into, but they give more smaller classes, they give more attention. So, and then some liberal arts schools have like honors programs to kind of take it up to another notch. Then a major can be a determining factor regarding a lane. Is it a really popular major like computer science or pre-med? So a student can stand out more by choosing humanities if it goes with their narrative. So that's another thing. Can you find out what the acceptance rate is for computer science roughly at the places where it's not the school you're applying to, but abroad like liberal arts? And that can be hard to find. But I know Harvard, I just read something, the Dean of Admissions was saying that they're always on the lookout for humanities because there just are so few people, less and less people are applying through the humanities. Then do you have that hook or edge being an athlete versus a non-athlete? And then what are you looking for? Is it need-based aid that you want? Or are you going after a merit scholarships? Or are you a full pay student? If you are a full pay family, you have an edge, as you will see as we dig into the numbers. So what I wanted to do.
Sorry, Ellen.
That's okay. I thought we would look specifically into Dartmouth because we have some good data from them. So I've got the bird's eye view of the Ivies. And I was just listening to Freakonomics, and they're doing a really great currently focus on higher ed and the competitive higher ed schools. And anyway, this is a quote from them saying that only 0.8% of all US college students go to Ivies. That's undergraduate and graduate combined. And so they're a finite number of spots. They're not making more spots for the Ivies. Part of the reason is, like, say at Brown, Providence, there isn't more room to expand. They're not happy about expansion that has been done in the past. So that is a reason why they might be not expanding. And exclusivity, they sell exclusivity. So that's why people want them. All right, so Ivies say as many, 80% of people are qualified is what a lot of the Ivies say, that students can do the academic work. So first would be they're going to check off and make sure your student quantitatively can do the work. What's their rank? What are their test scores? Do they have AP or IB, IB predictive scores or AP test scores? So if that's proven and they have the rigor along with a great GPA, because they go hand in hand, the box is kind of checked. Then they look at, who is this student? Are they an athlete? What is their specialty? Have they done research? Are they an expert in one or two areas? And how does that fit in with the mission of what the college is looking to do? So that is the qualitative. And then, so the broad defining characteristics are just a piece of the puzzle. And that's kind of what we just went over. Next slide. So looking at Dartmouth specifically, I had to take the current press release, which is about the students that were accepted. And then we have to compare it with last year's data, which are with the numbers with the students that enrolled. So they're not exactly the same, but using the two, we're able to glean some good information. And you can see that from 2024, that the amount of ED students, the admit rate has gone down. And but the overall rate, it's 6.2% for this year. But when you take out the ED, it's really in the 4s.
And you know what's interesting here is that in the class of 2024, they admitted about 543 early decision admits. That went up dramatically in 2025. That was probably because that was the height of the pandemic and they wanted to lock in students. But in addition to the increase of their early decision admits, they also increased the total class. So, they went from 10,057 to 1,228, which is a big increase for the size of their school, which I'm predicting means that in the next few years, they might have to cut back. Again, these schools are just bound by physical restrictions. So, because they took more one year, they may have to balance that off in the following years.
Well, and Debbie, it's not that they took more necessarily, it's that more they yielded more. And that's what happened last year. More, it's similar to Northeastern, more decided to come. So Dartmouth had to put out a lottery for $1 million. And they said that the first 200 students, or there's 200 students that were pulled out, we're going to get $5,000 not to come to the fall campus. Northeastern had to go and buy a hotel to be able to accommodate the extra students. So it's a problem. Yeah. And so that's the effects of one year to the next. And so this year they had to adjust accordingly.
And what we're just showing you an example of how to dig deeper. And it's not to highlight, Dartmouth, a selective school. You can find similar information and similar issues at schools like Arizona, University of Arizona, Berkeley. I mean, they're having national news related to wanting to expand and the neighborhood not allowing them to expand. So, this is kind of going that extra level layer deeper in terms of research to really understand what's happening at these schools, so that you have a better indication of how it might apply to your student and how it might apply to just their general admissions results for that particular year.
And I also do want to say with the ED, what I'm seeing is like schools are filling their class like 5 to 10% more than they used to pre-COVID. So 50% fill ED is not crazy. I think Bates is the most extreme and they fill 82%.
Yeah, Ellen and I saw that number and we were like, wait a minute, is that right? And we kept digging.
They've always
and
been high.
Right.
Yeah, Debbie, they've always been high, but now it's 82%. And even like Middlebury, I think it's like 65. So that's where ED is definitely an advantage. Okay, so this is the data that Dartmouth defined in their press release. They combine the Northeast and the Midwest together. So we only have these groupings of that with the South, the West, and international. Kind of interesting that they threw them international in with the mix. Usually they have that as a standalone, but this was the press release for this year. And so what's going on, like Rebecca said, is there are less students in the Northeast and the Midwest, and these colleges are taking more students from the South and the West because their bond rating depends upon it, because the health of the university to make sure that they're going to survive this shrinking population, if the school especially is located in the Northeast or the Midwest. So that's why you're going to see more and more of a trend this way. And so these are the numbers of percentage of students accepted is in the dark blue. And we don't know who's going to enroll yet, but imagine the numbers are going to be similar, paralleling. And then here's race and ethnicity. And so again, 2026, we'll see who ultimately enrolls, but you can see there's a mission to bring in, diversity at Dartmouth. Now, Amherst is like 62% on par with Wellesley at 62%. So Dartmouth is not as much as some of the small liberal arts schools, but this would again be a lane here. Like, I think Colby was 40% minority. So if you happen to be a person like a Caucasian, maybe Colby with 60% Caucasian might be your lane, so to speak. It's just something to keep in mind. Because students students, highly capable students, are either being accepted or heavily waitlisted because you don't always understand what the mission of the school is, or you do, and you just didn't make because of where your lane was, it just didn't work out. It wasn't because the student wasn't capable. So this is the public versus the private. So at Dartmouth, 40% came from private schools. And only 10% of high schools nationally are private. So again, same edge that Rebecca was talking about. And then the legacy number here, if that's a decent legacy number. So if a student happens to be a legacy, say to Dartmouth, often it's some schools specifically like Penn say you have to apply ED to get the advantage. Other schools don't specifically say it. But it can be more beneficial if a student does apply ED with legacy. And then financial aid. So 45% of admittance students here are full pay. Well, in these top highly selective schools, there are more from the top 1% than there are from the bottom 20% of income. So that is privilege going on there. So diversity. So again, like I said, if you're a full pay, you're going to have an advantage. And you can see here where the middle class is kind of squeezed, since 55% of the families are receiving aid, but almost half of that is low income, or are low income students. I want to say Colgate is one of the ones known for being notorious with having a huge amount of the 1%, and they have 60% full pay.
Wow.
Yeah, and part of the reason Colgate spiked with the huge rate of of applicants, was because they announced, I think if you make less than 125,000, I think it was, that you would not have to have loans. And I think that's what got, when COVID was going on, a lot of people, I think that caught their eye. Okay, so as we're wrapping this up, what we did was chose a sample student, so to speak. And so this student is a pretty common student, relatively speaking. More young women are applying to school than young men. I think it's close to 60%. So we have a female. We have someone in New England applying, because a lot of people, on average, people go 200 miles away from home. So Dartmouth's in New England. So we have someone applying from New England. This person happens to be Caucasian, and they went to a public school, because we know the majority of students go to public schools. And so what I did was, so of the 1,207 students accepted regular decision, because we took out early decision, I just kind of chose how to slice it and dice it. Now, this is not exact. The percentages could be put in a different order, but this is just to give people an idea. So if the New England location is 17% of this number, and we got that percentage from the class of 2025 of the people, again, in press releases of the people that ended up enrolling at Dartmouth, they gave this exact number, 17%. So that's 205 students are from New England, of the amounts that were accepted regular decision. And then if we cut that in half, because 50% of females, half of the class is female. So that's now 103 students. And now if we apply the 47% of students are Caucasian, now we're down to 48 students. And then the 60% of students are from public school, of this 48. And now we're down to 29 female Caucasian students from public school in New England got accepted to Dartmouth. And you can see how staggeringly small that number is for whatever lane your student is in.
So this is, this is not, we're not saying this to be, exact that we can predict this, but it just gives you a sense of, when you start to look at the numbers about where the kind of understanding, as Ellen is saying, what lane you might fall down, your student might fall down, and kind of how it's going to be sliced and diced, and how many of the type of student like your student is, a college might ultimately pick. And you can see how the numbers work out. Obviously, these numbers are going to end up being small at smaller schools. At larger schools, you might be able to do the same slicing and dicing. You might cut your numbers, but you're still going to have a potentially larger end result as compared to a smaller school.
Someone asked, I just happened to see how they know whether or not you're applying for aid if they're need blind. Usually on the Common App, it's a question, are you applying for, under this specific school, are you applying for aid? And then you have to say yes or no. They don't see how much you need. That goes to financial aid, but the admissions office sees that you are applying for aid. And I did read about admissions office that would say when they knew that the school was need aware, and they would say if a student was full pay, they would write on their app they were free, and if they needed aid, they wrote expensive on the app. So that puts it into perspective. Now, so this is what you can control, and Rebecca's going to kind of wrap up some of this stuff too, but the college list drives everything, as you can see, as you figure out your lane. So it's really important to do your research. It's really important to do those net price calculators and understand which schools can and will give the money. And unfortunately, the schools that give the most money are the hardest schools to get into because they have the biggest endowments, so they have the most prestige. So full pays are going after them, and students with need are going after them. And that drives up the applications and then drives down the acceptance rate. So figuring out your best admissions lane, like we went over the different variables. Are you going to apply, early decision or regular, and keeping in mind that most athletes come in through the ED, again, making it harder to get into. And hooks and legacies. So there's that. What you can control is your narrative. So, are you clearly defining it? Does your essay support it? Are you showing how you're singular in a few areas that you're, really standing out from other students? And, your activities in the Common App, similar idea to help, that you're not just another person who happens to be in, let's just say, student government that plays the violin, who also is a soccer player. Like, there's nothing wrong with all that, but there are a lot of students that have that kind of profile. So then how is it that your student really distinguishes themselves within that arena? And that's one of the things we like to help students with at, in the CIA program. And your essay is another thing, and demonstrate interest. And we're going to be doing a talk, or I'm going to be doing a talk about that in a couple of weeks, about all the different ways to show demonstrated interest to help your students stand out. And interviews, and showing interviews show demonstrated interest, and it's another way to really get your narrative out there too. So those are the things you can control, and that's the end of my part of the presentation, I think.
Okay, thanks, Ellen.
You're
And
welcome.
Rebecca's gonna just give you her words of wisdom.
Did you want me to do the implications, or?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes.
It's
Hold
okay.
on. Let me scroll back. Okay, yes.
All right. So basically, what have we gotten from tonight's presentation? So the most selective have become even more selective, and likely will continue to become even more selective because we are seeing that increase in applications, which ultimately results in lower acceptance rates. So our best advice would be to, it's okay to apply to some of those schools, but don't make your entire list those schools. Don't apply to even more of those schools. Pick ones that are truly your best fit, and then also look for target and likely options, which you'll have better chances of getting into on your list as well. So we always recommend a nice, well-balanced list. We have workshop on that. I'd say, like I said, with the increase in applications steadying out a little. It's still going up, but not quite as drastically. There will be less uncertainty. And so hopefully that will, once again, it'll just slow things down year after year. But yeah, those admit rates will continue to drop, but at slower rates. But that will result in more predictable yields from colleges. And so I know that in the past year or so, the wait list numbers, last year hardly anyone took students from the waiting list, whereas the year before, students took a higher percentage of students from the waiting list because of all the students that were deferring. So increased applications will continue to mean lower wait list admits, because ultimately students are getting into fewer schools, or they're getting those more highly selective schools they're not getting into, and so those spots aren't opening up. It doesn't trickle down as much. Is there next slide? So words of wisdom. So this was actually posted so a college admissions counselor Facebook group has people from college admissions and college counselors like myself, high school based or independent. And this one woman posted in the group and something that she sent to her students, and we kind of summarized it and wanted to share it with you here. So your student has the time, ability, and resources to put together a strong, clean application that tells their story. So if you start now, and especially if you join our group and listen to our workshops and attend our workshops, you will have all the resources available to put together a really strong application packet. It is a packet. There are a lot of different components, that Ellen was describing earlier. There's the application itself, the essay, there's recommendations, there's the classes they're taking senior year, the activities that they do. There's so many things that go into the grades, the test scores, so many things that go into it. You start now, you will have that time and ability and resources to put together. Choice to take that rigorous schedule senior year. So if, let's say the classes aren't maybe as rigorous as you feel like your student can handle, and don't really represent what they're passionate about academically, see if you can change that class. First, see if you can get a different schedule for senior year. I know that today was meeting with students about their schedules for next year. So that is still going on at many schools. Choice on how to spend their summer. I was actually meeting with a student today about, some are going to take classes over the summer. Another student, we were talking about, maybe doing some free online classes, massive online open courses, or if she's into political science. So I said, there's, the midterm elections, so maybe get involved with a political campaign. There are ways to spend your summer that you have control over, and where to apply. So, do the research. The College Insights tool is really phenomenal. That's Debbie and I really connected on that. She's like my spirit animal, because I have my own a separate spreadsheet before I even met her that was eerily similar to her table that she has on College Insights. It's amazing resource that is the most comprehensive set of data that I've really seen out there in the most organized fashion. And I've looked at pretty much every website there is. Show your interest in those schools. You have time to visit the colleges. If you can't visit them, reach out to them, do their online virtual tour. You can sign up and they'll get your name. That's demonstrating interest. Ellen said she's going to talk about different ways to demonstrate interest coming up soon. But be open-minded, be realistic, be financially responsible, and then include some of your dream schools, right? I said it's okay to have some of those really highly, competitive schools, but also be realistic, be open-minded to those schools that might not be as prestigious or highly selective, but have really amazing things to offer. And so just know that this is a process. It's called the college admissions process for a reason. You don't just apply. If you just go and submit your application, it's not going to be as successful as if you take time to do it right. It's not perfect. There are flaws in the process. Colleges might not prioritize the things that you think are important. I have probably the most impressive student of my career this year, and she didn't get into so many schools that I thought she should have gotten into. She's international, that played a factor, but it's just so, highly competitive. and it can be unfair. There might be students who get in, because of athletics or something that, maybe their grades aren't as strong. It could be unfair, but it can also be really rewarding when you do the research, find schools that might be target or likely schools that, you can be happy with. And, if you put in a lot of work and then do get into that dream school, that's great too. So it's kind of all of those things.
So we will go through and answer some questions, but again, I just want to remind people, the session we gave tonight is just an example of the types of sessions we do. Again, 3 to 5 times a month. And we also, you can go to the Road to College website. You could go to the Facebook group. There's a lot of free information. And so I think what you get if you join the membership is a little bit of peace of mind, not having to worry about, am I missing something? And really also having great resources like Rebecca, like Ellen to lean on, because the reality is that people run into roadblocks. It happens all the time. You're not quite sure what to do next, and you just need a place to ask a question. In addition, we actually have some people similar to Ellen and Rebecca who have financial backgrounds. We talked in detail about FAFSA and CSS profile and the net price calculator. So we cover both the pure admission side and the financial side. So there is no pressure. This is just hopefully you've gotten a lot of detail out of tonight, and it's just an example of the types of sessions that we run and the level of detail and the level of support that we provide. So I'm going to look through some of the questions to see if we can answer a few, and then everybody should go and enjoy the rest of the night, or probably go to sleep. So somebody asked about the accuracy of the net price calculators. Really, how accurate are the merit scholarships that some of the net price calculators may or may not include? I don't know, Ellen, if you want to kind of talk about that, what your experience is, what you've seen, how much to rely on net price calculators.
So I have a lot of experience with that. I love doing net price calculators. And so with my oldest, she got in ED, and the amount on the net price calculator was accurate. It was spot on. These schools for ED, they want to give the money. They don't want students to, they don't want to get a bad name, let's say. They're going to meet the need for ED that they would meet for regular decision. So that is not an issue. Obviously, if a student applies, gets in a couple place regular decision, and they can leverage things a bit, sometimes you might be able to get a little bit more money, but basically it should be, if you put the right numbers into the net price calculator, you should be getting, early decision, that number. I've called up the financial aid departments of many different schools. They're very helpful. They have walked me through how to even fill out the CSS profile. Can't say enough good things about financial aid departments. So any questions, call them. Specifically merit. Merit can be tricky. Some schools like the University of Alabama, very specific, give you the GPA range that you need to have and or test scores, and very clear. Other schools, quite a bit more nebulous. So it really just depends. Generally, I think you can look at how like merit is defined. What I usually do is go to the Google, merit scholarships and the school, and see what the school happens to say. And they'll be very specific, give you all the parameters. If they do that, it will be listed on that page. If not, it will just be more like, oh, we have our top scholarships, 40,000, that we have another one for 30, whatever it is. And then you just have to put together, the best your student can, best presentation of your student, and hope for the best. So again, every school is different, but that's a great question to ask an admissions officer, to say, how accurate is this? What are the parameters? And that's
do you even
way.
include merit scholarships in your calculation?
Yes, exactly. And some of them, a lot of them don't. But ones that they do, if they ask for a student's GPA, for example, then that there's going to be merit being put into the calculation. And yeah, that's just not of an exact science as it is when it's clearly spelled out like the University of Alabama. So that can be a little tricky.
So somebody actually asked a really good question also related to net price calculator, and they're wondering if that information is shared with anybody. Yeah, it's usually, it's not, they're not trying to kind of gather. They're not using it as like a lead generation or anything.
Yeah, I made up my own College Board account and put in like fake data, and that and when you go into a CSS profile school, it automatically populates the data into their net price calculator, so it can be done like that. And that's what I just hold on to that, and you can jump from school to school within seconds if they're on the CSS profile. Then there's ones that are not, and you have to put the data in every single time, but just have it ready in a folder. And once you know what you're doing, you can put that data in like 5 minutes. And then you can save the data. You can have the URL sent to just, you can then save the URL. And that's what I do. I go back and look at it that way. And then you also have that as a record. If you filled it in properly, then you can say to financial aid, hey, this number was off, the offer you gave me, and this is what I was expecting. And so that's a little bit of leverage there too. And that of course assumes you put in the proper data.
Another interesting question related to financial aid is how do the schools know that you are full pay? Should you not fill out the FAFSA?
Well, some schools you have to fill out the FAFSA to get merit aid. So that is another question you should ask. But again, on the Common App, they will ask, are you applying for aid? And then you will say no. And I do know that someone said no, and the school actually called, I think it was the financial aid department, and said, are you sure you are not applying? Because so many people do. And the person said, no, we are not applying for aid. But that's how thorough they can be, to be clear. This person actually was ED, so I think they had time to kind of call, and that's one of the benefits of ED. There are less applications, there's more time to spend with students, because you're lucky. Back before COVID, you got 8 minutes on average. Now I can only imagine what it is.
Yeah. Rebecca, somebody is asking maybe if we can give a little bit more explanation of the difference between early admission, regular, and rolling.
So, all right. So regular decision is typically the final deadline, if there is a deadline. Generally that's in January, although a few schools, a few of the larger public universities will have earlier deadlines. The University of California system is November 30th. There's some with December 1st and November 1st deadlines as well. So that is generally the final deadline that you can apply to a school. And you generally hear by March, you can apply to as many regular decision schools as you want. And then you'll generally hear in March and have to have April to decide by May 1st. Rolling is if a school does not have a set deadline. So oftentimes applications open in August. August 1st is when the common application goes live, and you can start applying then. And there are some schools that you can start hearing back in about 6 weeks. So you can have an acceptance in September. I actually saw one girl from a school I used to work at applied in August, like early August, and by the end of August had her first college decision. So
which is just a nice kind of reassuring thing to have.
Amazing. So you can have those, and there are tons of rolling schools. The other benefit to rolling schools are, they don't have a set deadline, and so you can apply in March or April. Let's say you're not getting the decisions you want, there still are options in colleges accepting applications. So those are options as well. With the more highly selective rolling colleges, it is first come, first serve for a lot of programs. So it does become harder to get into more competitive programs the later on in the application cycle. And then early applications, so there's early action, which is non-binding, so you can apply to really as many of them as you want. Those you apply in November, generally here December or January if you've been admitted, most often December, but some in January. And then if you apply early decision, you apply in November, for early decision 1, you'll hear in December before the holiday break. And so that is binding those. You can only apply to one school early decision. But then if you get into that school, then you are committing to attend. If you do not get into that school, or if they, let's say, defer you to the regular decision round, so they're saying, we can't accept your early decision, but we'll reconsider your application in regular decision, then you are no longer bound to them if admitted in regular decision, and you can apply to an early decision 2 school. So you can apply to 2 early decisions if you don't get into your first one. And then early decision, or let's say you maybe didn't get to visit your school in time to apply early decision 1, maybe early decision 2 is your chance to kind of commit to that school.
So Rebecca, there's another question also about what are your thoughts? How much of an effort should a student make to meet an admissions officer at the schools that they're interested in?
I mean, I would say if it's not unreasonable, they should make an effort. So like if the college is visiting their school, then they should absolutely 100% attend that information session. If they can't for some reason, let's say they have a test during that time, they should reach out to that admissions officer and say, hey, I really wanted to attend your session, but I was unable to because I had a test, and maybe, ask them a question or something like that. If you have a chance to visit a school, that's a really great way to demonstrate interest, and it's the best way for you to see if it's really an environment that you would want to be in. That being said, if it's across the country and you don't have the resources necessarily to visit, that's understandable. There are lots of ways that you can demonstrate interest. But it is always good for them to, know who you are if possible. But they're meeting, thousands of students each year as well. So they're not necessarily always going to remember everybody they meet, but if you stand out, they'll write a note. So it's definitely worth visiting. And even if they don't remember you, they'll have a card, that you fill out when you meet them that will remind them that they met you. So definitely make an effort, but don't miss a test for it. Just let them know you had a test.
Oh, here's a good question. Somebody's asking, if you apply ED1 and the school has ED2, if you're deferred, what are you deferred to? Are you deferred
to generally to regular decision? On rare circumstances, it might be to early decision 2, but generally you're released from that early decision contract, and then you'd be just reviewed within the regular decision pool. And you most often should not count on being admitted, because if you weren't admitted in a smaller pool, the chances that you'll be admitted in that larger pool are slim.
Okay.
It does happen, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. And we did try and get through this faster, but we are still on to an hour and a half. But hopefully we got through a lot of this so that if people couldn't stay on as long, that they were able to leave early and still get enough information. So thank you, everyone. We will send a link to this out tomorrow, and feel free to reach out again if you want more information like this, if you want access to ask these types of questions to Ellen, Rebecca. We have Luann Lee, who also does financial aid work. Hopefully you'll join. And if not, I am sure we will still see you around on the Paying for College group, or just in general on the internet. I definitely see people's names, and it's nice to get to know people through this process, even though we are all still virtual, but it's still nice to see people's faces and recognize their names. Okay, everyone. Good night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.